Thank you, Jennifer. I neglected to mention that Jennifer was also the winner or the recipient of this prestigious Keeper of the 10th, as in the 10th Amendment award, as you can see. So finally, to close up the presentations, we're going to have Lord Christopher Monckton. He's been a perennial speaker, as many of you obviously know. I can see he probably doesn't really need a full introduction, but I'll just mention a few of the curious things that I noticed in his extensive bio. He's the inventor of eternity puzzles. Isn't that fascinating? He also crashed the Sunday Telegraph website in 2006 through an article that he wrote about global warming, saying, well, it wasn't really a crisis, and people got very excited about that. On Labor Day in 2008, he actually spoke on a mountaintop, a reclaimed mountaintop, to 100,000 mine workers about these issues. It's astounding. And finally, you know, this was the most interesting to me. Back in 1986, he actually started the Hadley Center for Forecasting as an advisor to Margaret Thatcher. And this is a center that today works very closely with the IPCC. So clearly, he has a bit of a different perspective today. So without further ado, Lord Christopher Monckton.
Well, my dear good friends, why are you all still here? You could have taken the afternoon off. But I face you with more than usual trepidation today because those were two of the finest presentations it's been my privilege to hear. Benny Peiser was all too horrifyingly accurate about the way that the European tyranny by Clark is closing Europe down in the name of saving the planet, and is therefore transferring emissions, our sins of emission, to countries where, per unit of production, their emissions are even higher than in Europe. So they're destroying the planet and destroying Europe. That is how insane it is. But then, Jennifer, now I have had the honor of visiting Montana. Indeed, I campaigned for Donald Trump and raised funds for him in Montana before the last election. So now you know how he got elected. And it is the most beautiful state, but the signs of damage caused by environmentalists who actually came into Montana from out of state and began radicalizing people living in the towns, notably Bozeman, so that they would start influencing their Congress people in the state to do the land in the wrong way. They don't clear the timber when it falls, and this is an enormous fire risk. And so when they got that big wildfire in Montana last year, immediately the BBC said that was because of global warming. Well, no, it wasn't. And I should like to offer, Jennifer, my modest proposal. You have a large national debt, which is getting frighteningly larger by the minute. If you sell off the federal lands to the highest bidder, you can get rid of your national debt and have the federal lands properly managed. I wouldn't trust the states any more than I would trust the federal government, but I would trust individual ranchers every time. So I hope, therefore, that the free market solution, which is what I usually favor in these situations, will commend itself to Jennifer, whose slides, incidentally, were the most beautiful I've ever seen. I think they were lovely. Well, now, I'm going to talk to you about the economics and the policy that goes with the economics. And we're going to address a bit later in the presentation what I call the candy cane question, which is the fundamental question of economics. And before I get onto that, there is, as our chairman pointed out in his introductory remarks earlier, A question without which, if you don't answer this, there is no rational basis whatsoever for taking any action whatsoever to make global warming go away. And that question that they have never answered is this one. What is the ideal global mean surface temperature? Has any of you seen in any of the prolix, inspisate, tedious reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change any estimate of what the ideal global mean surface temperature is? I do not see any hands. Has anyone ever seen any estimate in any scientific paper or from any even of the various pressure groups of what the ideal global temperature is? I still see no hands. And that tells you all that you need to know about whether this subject is an economic subject and a scientific subject where it is necessary for us to act, or whether it is a purely political subject in which the totalitarian faction has seized upon it to try to make us feel guilty and to end up destroying Western freedom, prosperity, and independence. That's what this is all about. Because if you don't answer that question, there is no rational basis for action. Now, their wild predictions, as we saw earlier today, have been pronouncedly exaggerated. And this is even though CO2 is rising faster than IPCC's business-as-usual scenario, as set out in its first assessment report in 1990. There is the most recent figure that's been done. And you can see it's above the worst-case scenario, worst case from their point of view. And yet, the temperature has failed to rise at anything like a rate consistent with that amount of CO2 under their predictions. And we see this here. Their prediction is the red bar on this graph. The expected and observed warmings, respectively, are the orange and green bars. And you can see there's absolutely no connection between what should have happened and what they are predicting has happened. No connection at all. And then there are the somehow unreported in the various media who have been here today, including the unspeakable BBC and the even more unspeakable Weather Channel. They do not report just how many times the disasters that are supposed to follow from global warming have been predicted but have failed to come to pass. Let us look first of all at drought. Now, over the whole of the 20th century and into the 21st, there has been no trend in the area of the Earth under drought. But as you will see, there is something of a downturn from about 1970 onwards. And if we look at that more closely in a recent paper, which is not the same index, but it is asking what is the percentage of the globe that's under drought conditions, there has been a fall throughout the 30 years during which most of the global warming that we could have caused has actually happened. Now, there is a scientific explanation for this. It is that as the atmosphere, space occupied by the atmosphere warms, it is capable of carrying near exponentially more water vapor, and at or near the surface, it actually does so. Therefore, there is less drought. But did they tell you this? No. Sea level change, according to the best satellite we ever had to measure sea level change, which was the Envisat satellite, it showed sea level changing at a rate of 1.5 inches per century. And that is probably the best estimate of sea level change that we've actually got. But what do they report? They report an enormous increase in sea level. And why do they do this? Here, between 2003 and 2009, there was actually a fall in global sea level. And yet it was reported, as you will see here in Kazanav et al. 2009, as a large increase. How did they get away with this? They made a glacial isostatic adjustment. I don't have time to tell you what that is. I will simply tell you that whatever it is, whether or not it is justified, and I happen to think it isn't justified, but even if it was, it does not in any sense constitute an actual or potential sea level rise. So they are making up sea level rise. It is a straightforward fiction. And you can see that because sea level hasn't actually risen, each successive report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has had to reduce the predictions compared with the previous report. This graph actually appeared without the large numbers for the years on it in the IPCC's 2013 Fifth Assessment Report. How many news media have you seen that have actually pointed out that the sea level predictions by the IPCC have been falling, and falling in each of their successive reports? Global sea ice loss is very small, and if you go back 750 million years or even longer in this particular graph, now some of you will be too young to remember this, but the fact is there's been an extraordinary mismatch between the CO2 concentration, which was at one stage 7,000 parts per million, and now it's 400. And we're saying the planet's going to catch fire in 18 months, as poor Chaza puts it. Well, no, it isn't. And so there's a mismatch there. And if you go just to the last 8,000 years, this is the late Bob Carter's favorite graph of all. What it shows is that you have the atmospheric CO2 concentration, which is more or less the same all around the world because it's a well-mixed greenhouse gas, actually going up, while the temperature at the summit of the Greenland ice cap, which is where polar amplification is supposed to come through most vigorously, has been falling for 8,000 years. And your BBC won't tell you that. Methane, care for it, tax. The methane is barely rising. It's still less than 2 parts per million. And yet, they have been predicting all sorts of things because of methane rising and saying we can't have cows and we must all eat grass instead. And here you can see that, again, the predictions in each of the first 4 assessment reports were excessive. This graph was to have appeared in the 5th assessment report, for which I was an expert reviewer, so I got a copy of this and kept it very carefully. And then when the report came out, they'd taken the graph out, because 2 member states, including France, had said, oh, we don't want that in because the skeptics will make an issue of it if we do. Well, get this, we're making an issue of it because you didn't. Forest fires cause, as you've just heard, less and less damage each decade, except in places like Montana, where the federal government manages the forest so badly that if they catch fire, thousands of acres each time are destroyed. And it was a particularly bad season last year for that. But here you can see the global figures. There are the CO2 emissions in metric tons. They're going up. And the forest fires around the world have been going down. Why? Because there's more moisture in the atmosphere, among other things, and therefore there's more rainfall, there's less drought, less reason for forests to catch fire. And all of these are elementary scientific considerations which are ruthlessly and relentlessly excluded from the public debate by those who are advancing the, frankly, communistic totalitarian agenda that really lurks behind climate change. In the US, heat waves are considerably less common than they were in the 1930s, when it was a lot warmer in the US than it is today. And you'll see that there's been a downtrend in heat waves in the United States since 1930. How many of you have seen that fact reported in any mainstream news medium? And US heat-related deaths have been tumbling in each of the last few decades. And the hurricane activity is decreasing. This is measured by the accumulated cyclone energy index, and you see that it's decreasing. You take account of the frequency, intensity, and duration of hurricanes, and you add it up and you get a number. This is done at the University of Florida, I think, by Dr. Ryan Maui. And the hurricane activity is decreasing. Why is this? Well, I asked Dick Lindzen that once, and of course, as always, he knew the answer. And he said, well, it's because if you get warmer weather, then the differentials between temperatures in one part of the atmosphere and another will decline, and it's those differentials in temperatures that cause storminess. And he said certainly in the tropics, and possibly in the extratropics as well, you would expect less storminess, and we're getting less storminess. And that's not a bad thing. Then there's ocean so-called acidification. This is their backup plan. Now, the ocean is not, and under modern conditions cannot possibly become acidic. And the reason is that it is strongly buffered by the rocks in which it sloshes about. and it's simply impossible for it to become acid. There are very, very strong homeostatic processes caused by those rocks. And even if you find the very few places in the world where they actually have a time series of what has happened to the pH of the oceans, you will see that the rate of decline is equivalent to 0.2 pH points over a century. Now, admittedly, this is a scale which means that that's about a 60% change over a century. But we know from looking at what happens when spate rivers discharge into coastal waters where there are corals, such as the Great Barrier Reef, that these huge discharges that can come out after the flash floods you often get in Australia do not kill the corals. They're perfectly capable of accommodating, even far more suddenly than any change we could cause, to changes in the pH caused by putting rainwater, which is acid, pronouncedly so, into the oceans, which are not. And these are how the papers on ocean acidification have been growing in quantity over recent years. These are Me Too papers. People saying, oh, we can get grants if we pretend that this is a problem. So they think up some sort of dopey reason for writing a paper about it, and they get them published because they fit the story, they fit the party line. Well, now we're coming on to the cost in terms of jobs and lives of global warming policy. Now, as you will all know, the miners, and I have a big soft spot for the miners, they are having their jobs and their industries destroyed, coal-fired power stations and all the downstream activities from them being destroyed in the name of global warming. So it's bad enough, even in the Western countries, the effect, as we've just heard in Europe in particular, of global warming policy. Not of global warming, which is doing no harm at all and is net beneficial, as we'll see later. But great harm is being done, but the real harm is being done in the developing countries. If you want to end poverty, so the totalitarian left seem to be saying, then kill the poor. There are 1.3 billion people, that's about a sixth of the population of this planet, who have no access to electrical power. And when I tell you how access is defined, it's the equivalent of lighting one 60-watt light bulb for only 4 hours a day. You'll realize that not having even that is a very serious problem. And this is what it does. 4.3 million deaths a year just from particulate pollution in open cooking fires. Then you get another cause of death. 500,000 women a year die in childbirth because there's no electricity at the point where the child is born. And these are just two of the many causes of death because countries don't have electricity. So what do we do to help them out? Well, we can see that we have blazes of light over Europe. Africa really is the dark continent. And look what that does to life expectancy. The lack of electricity is the chief cause of the low life expectancy in Africa. And light is also correlated to IQ. IQ in darkest Africa is 70, which we would regard as educationally subnormal. It's not because they're black, it's not because they're stupid, it's because they can't read at night. In the well-lit West, 100. In the dazzling Far East, 120. We are educationally subnormal compared with the Far East. But the World Bank, responding to the pleas of countries to help them to electrify, stopped lending for the construction of coal-fired power stations as far back as 2010 because global warming. And they won't lend for oil and gas extraction after this year, again, because global warming. And that, ladies and gentlemen, let us not mince words, that is genocide by inaction. Then there's the environmental cost of environmentalism. And here is what the UN's own Right to Food rapporteur, Herr Jean Ziegler, said in 2007, that it's a crime against humanity, his words, not mine, to convert agricultural productive soil into soil which produces foodstuffs that will be turned into biofuel. And on this graph, just to the left of the letter E for ethanol, that is 2007, look how they paid attention to his remarks. They paid no attention to his remarks. And then you have windmills, 14th century technology to address a 21st century non-problem. And here is the number of the beast. 666 kilometers an hour is the speed at which the tip of a 7 megawatt turbine rotating at 20 RPM will be traveling. Birds and bats can't get out of the way in time, and they're being killed, as you see here, in their millions all around the world. And then you can see the other problem with these, the many problems of these windmills. One of them is that they don't abate CO2 emissions because you have to keep spinning reserve power stations running for the 3/4 of the time when the wind either isn't blowing at all or is blowing too much. And then you have solar panels, and the trouble with them is however hard they've tried to redesign them, they cannot make them work at night. So again, you need spinning reserve. Then you have, electric cars. Anybody here got one? Don't, my advice, because they weigh 30% more than a real car, and therefore they require 30% more energy than a real car. So we've just spent the last 40 years, of most of my life in fact, watching the motor industry make the internal combustion engine 30% more efficient. Then along come the Greens and say, right, what we want to do is to drive it right back to the 1940s and have cars that are, in energy terms, as inefficient as they were in the 1940s. And this is regarded, ladies and gentlemen, as progress. Then there are the unreported benefits of more CO2 in the air. Here is what happens to crops. Now, of course, a lot of this is due to better agricultural methods and better fertilizers and so forth. But quite a lot of it, and we can prove this, is because the CO2 has increased. CO2 is plant food. I once asked one of these greeny reporters in Australia, actually it was in Wagga Wagga, and I said, where do you think the carbon in the tree trunks comes from? Because they're made of wood, which is carbon. She said, well, it comes from the ground, of course. No, I said, all of it comes from the air. And she had absolutely no idea. And I said, that's why we need more CO2, because it greens the planet. And it increases crop yields. This is Craig Idsow's graph. I promised him I'd show this. And there are about 40 different crops here, and all of them show wonderful increases in crop yield if you double CO2. How do we know? Because you can actually do a real greenhouse effect by putting them in a greenhouse, adding CO2 to the atmosphere, and seeing what happens to the growth of the plants. That's how it's done. And CO2 is literally greening the planet. Look at even Australia, whose largest geographical feature is called the Great Sandy Desert, because it is great, it is sandy, and it is a desert. You know where you are with the Australians. And it is greening. It's greening because of more moisture in the atmosphere, because of global warming, and it's also greening because the CO2 fertilization means that the plants can breathe more easily. They need fewer stomata, the mouths underneath their leaves through which they breathe, and therefore they lose less water with more CO2 in the atmosphere, a point that Will Happer is very fond of making. So these are all good things about CO2, and they are never mentioned. Keeping people cold kills them. This is EU survey. And let's just look at the balance between excess deaths from heat on the left and prevented deaths from cold on the right. Let's net off the two figures. Even if you were to get 5.4 Kelvin of warming by as soon as 2080, there would be 94,000 more people alive in Europe than if you didn't do that, because cold is the big killer and heat spares lives. And now we get finally and very briefly to the candy cane question, the fundamental question of economics. Imagine you're Tom Sawyer and you find a few coins in the street and you go into your local sweetie shop and you say to the proprietor, say, mister, and you slap the coins on the counter, say, mister, how many candy canes can I get for this? Now, the accent needs work. But the sentiment is very sound. Every child knows that you want to know how many sweeties you can buy with your bawbees. How much can you get for your money? How much bang for the buck? That's the central question of economics. And it is the one question that is never asked by governments using other people's money to spray around and try to buy the non-happening of global warming. And if you take that kind of callous attitude and you don't care how careful you are about spending other people's money, then this is what happens to your currency. This is what will happen to the dollar if you allow the Green New Deal to take place. You'll start printing $100 trillion bills, and that won't even buy you a loaf of bread. So how then does economics actually decide how much you should spend? The answer is it has a concept called present value. You have a discount rate that says that if you go further down the years, when the benefit comes in from global warming prevention, then that's worth less to us than the money we're spending now. So you have a discount rate to allow for that. And the bird in the hand rule is that $1 today is worth more to us than $1 100 years hence. Now, the market intertemporal discount rate, as it is called, is at minimum 5%. Personally, I wouldn't get out of bed for less than 10, and the average market discount rate is about 7. But now let's look at Sir Nicholas Stern, now Lord Stern, whom the socialist government in Britain in 2006 said, please write a report justifying spending money on making global warming go away, and he found that he couldn't. So he invented an artificially low discount rate, 1/4 of the absolute minimum that he should have used, and then suddenly he could make out that it was worthwhile doing something about global warming. How did he reach that discount rate? By making an assumption not stated in his report and only admitted under pressure from me and others a long time later, that he was assuming that there was going to be a 10% probability that global warming would bring an end to the planet by 2100. That is how silly all of this is. And totalitarianism, by choosing artificially low discount rates, manages to do a really stupid double. First of all, of course, it harms current generations because we're squandering on this global warming policy money that should be left back in the pockets of the taxpayers so they can buy the federal lands in Montana. But undermining current economic development, and this is a quote from President Václav Klaus at a conference I organized at Cambridge some years ago, harms future generations as well because you're going to leave them less money because you've squandered it instead of saving it up for them. And if we look at the Stern said, well, 3% is going to be the cost of GDP all the way through the 21st century if we don't do anything about global warming. That was his central cost. But he was doing that at a 1.4% discount rate. If you reconvert that using this simple little econometric equation here to a 5% discount rate, that comes down by an order of magnitude to 0.3% of GDP. I wouldn't get out of bed to worry about a 0.3% change in GDP because of global warming, even if I thought that Stern was right about any of this, which I do not. So is CO2 mitigation cost effective? And we end on this note. We're going to look very briefly at the British zero emissions by 2050 plan. This is economic harakiri 101. And we're going to make some simplifying assumptions, of which the most important is the one at the bottom there, that we're going to assume that official climatology knows what the heck it's doing, and we might actually get the amount of global warming that they predict. The fact that we're not getting it is we'll pretend to hold our nose and not say that. Now, here are the main figures of this policy, of which arguably the most important one is what percentage of global emissions would be abated if you wiped the UK off the map altogether. And the answer is a staggering 0.88%, and you begin to see where this is going. Because then we can work out, using a formula which the economists can't use because they don't know enough about climate change, and this formula tells you how much warming you will abate. And if for 30 years we worked out that we were going to do away with all CO2 emissions altogether from the UK, this would get rid of an impressive 3/1000ths of a Kelvin of global warming at the cost, which you can see later is enormous. And you'll see that the forecast business as usual CO2 concentration by the climatologists in 2050, if we did nothing, 477.7 parts per million. But Britain comes to the rescue and shows leadership by destroying its economy faster than anybody else. And sure enough, it brings down the CO2 concentration from 477.7 to 477.1. And that's leadership, ladies and gentlemen. And so then you can have fun at working out the unit abatement cost of abating 1 Kelvin of anthropogenic global warming by policies equivalent to Britain's zero-emission plan. It's a modest $273 trillion for each Kelvin that you make to go away. And these are on very, very optimistic assumptions. And then you can look at the cost of stopping the 0.38 Kelvin of global warming that will happen over the next 30 years using their central estimates. 150 trillion in cash, $20,000 per capita of the entire global population. How many people in Africa are going to be able to afford that? And that's about 3% of global GDP, again on very, very favorable assumptions. And so the action-inaction ratio is that it's 10 times more expensive on these optimistic assumptions to try to mitigate global warming than to let it happen and adapt to it. So the economic conclusions and the conclusion of my talk are as follows. Climate action would actually cost even more than this case history indicates, particularly because if CO2 residence time is 125 years, as IPCC says, little mitigation can occur this century, whatever we do. No policy, therefore, to abate global warming by taxing, trading, regulating, replacing, or reducing greenhouse gas emissions will prove cost-effective solely on grounds of the welfare benefit from climate mitigation. You'd have to have some other reason for doing this, which they don't. CO2 mitigation strategies that are inexpensive enough to be affordable will be ineffective. Strategies costly enough to be effective will be unaffordable. Focused adaptation, even if there were a problem as big as they say, is far and away the best way to go. The cost of the premium greatly exceeds the cost of the risk insured, and therefore do not take out the insurance. Climate concern, in any case, as we saw earlier, sprang from the elementary error of physics, after correction of which there will be so little warming by 2100 that that warming will be net beneficial. Therefore, the cost of climate action exceeds any legitimately foreseeable benefit, and therefore, since I'm required to answer the question, what should the best policy be on global warming, the best policy is to fold our arms, do nothing, sit back, and enjoy the sunshine. God bless you all, and thank you.